You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, Trump's lawyer tried to pull a stunt in the ongoing E. Jean Carroll defamation case. Can you speak on what happened here?
Brian, I think you selected the perfect word, stunt. It's not unusual for attorneys to make mistrial motions, but what's extremely unusual is for a judge ever to grant a mistrial motion. That means something so dramatically wrong in violation of the rules of evidence or some procedure of the court. Something so wrong has happened that the judge has to just throw the case out and then sort of debate on whether the case should be allowed to be rebrought, whether it's a civil lawsuit or a criminal prosecution. So I will say motions for mistrial are often made, rarely granted. And I love this because here's what the New York Times reported Tacopina's stated reason for moving for a mistrial was. He said that the court had made pervasive, unfair, and prejudicial rulings. Witch hunt. Okay, now I added the witch hunt, but isn't
Right.
that kind of what it sounds like?
Yeah.
Tacopina didn't even have something concretely to point to. Basically, what his argument was that, you know what, Judge Kaplan, you've just made the proceedings unfair. You're biased against my client and in favor of E. Jean Carroll. That kind of an attack on a judge never works. And think about it. In order to be successful in that kind of a mistrial motion, Judge Kaplan would have to say to himself, you know what? I have been entirely unfair throughout the trial, so I'm going to throw the trial out. It doesn't happen. I can tell you, my 30 years as a prosecutor, I had countless mistrial motions made by defense attorneys and had exactly zero granted by the court.
Can pulling a stunt like this hurt Tacopina's case with the judge and the jury since he's basically trying to invalidate the work of those very people?
It can't hurt the case in the eyes of the jury because these kind of motions are litigated out of the presence of the jury. So they should actually know nothing about Tacopina filing a mistrial motion or how the judge resolved the motion. Can it hurt you in the eyes of the judge? It shouldn't, because judges are used to, let's call them attorney shenanigans, and they usually don't let that seep in to the way they preside over a trial. Flip side of that coin is judges are human beings. And if an attorney begins to lose credibility with a judge, well, then I think that judge is going to be a lot less receptive to arguments that attorney makes moving forward, through the pendency of the case.
We've spoken about this before, but I think it's worth reiterating. Why is a judge's relationship to the lawyer, for example, to Joe Tacopina, important here when ultimately it's going to be the jury that decides the outcome of this case?
Yeah, because the judge is the gatekeeper of the evidence. Judges look to the attorneys in the proceedings to be honest, to be candid, to only make arguments that are supported by the law or by the rules. And once the judge gets the sense that one attorney doesn't really care about the rules, what will happen is the judge will then always look to the other party to get an accurate account of, for example, well, what does the case law say about how I should rule on a particular objection or a particular point of law? Brian, your credibility with the judge is everything to an attorney. So once you lose that credibility, that standing in the eyes of the judge, things typically will not go well for you.
Glenn, is this something that an attorney would do if the case in general is going in a good direction for him?
Makes perfect sense, right? I think I'm winning hands down, so I want the trial to be thrown out and start all over again. No,
Yeah.
this is an indication that Team Trump thinks things aren't going too good for us right now. So let's throw a mistrial motion in the mix. Now, I will tell you, attorneys will make mistrial motions for basically three reasons. One is a legitimate legal reason. If you don't do something in the trial court, you don't object to a piece of evidence being admitted, or you don't make a mistrial motion if you think the proceedings were unfair, and then you lose and you want to appeal that issue to the appellate court, let's assume some appellate court judge thinks, well, you know what? Maybe they were in mistrial territory. If you didn't make the motion for a mistrial, you've waived your right to raise it on appeal. It's called preserving issues for appeal. So it's not unusual for defense attorneys to make a mistrial motion somewhere along the way. So in the event they think they'll get some play on that issue with one or more appellate court judges, they will have preserved their right to argue it on appeal. Second reason defense attorneys will make, or any attorneys, defense attorneys typically will make a mistrial motion. It is to get the opposing counsel off their game, because now they have to spend long hours at night, writing up a response to what is largely a frivolous mistrial motion. That is time consuming and distracting attorneys from other important tasks that they could otherwise be turning their attention to during the course of the trial. Third reason, in a case like this, publicity, PR, right? Because what are we now talking about? Donald Trump's mistrial motion. We saw the story all over the cable news in recent days. So I think, Joey Tacopina may have gotten exactly what he wanted, some PR. And when people hear, oh my goodness, a mistrial motion has been filed by the defense team, what do people immediately think? Boy,
something went wrong to warrant it.
You know what? Yeah. Nothing went wrong in the trial except Joey Tacopina filing what was probably a frivolous motion because Judge Kaplan promptly denied the motion.
Yeah, and by the way, we've seen this before, this phenomenon before, where Trump basically tries to just insert something into the I guess the zeitgeist, and then just the fact that they inserted that accusation, which is, for example, what happened during the stolen election saga of 2020, where they just kept claiming that there was fraud in the election. And of course, we know, thanks to the results of those more than 60 cases that went through the courts, that none of them were actually validated, that there was never any proven claims of fraud. But because they had introduced it into the ecosystem so much, that's all we heard for weeks and weeks and months, people started to believe it just by virtue of hearing it so much. It didn't matter to them whether it was ultimately proven true or not, because the point of that wasn't the truth. The point was just to basically change the narrative. And that's exactly what they got then, and that's clearly what they're trying to do now.
What a great parallel. And think of a couple of instances where Trump has done that to great effect. As you say, in the whole stolen election nonsense, remember when his DOJ officials went to him and said there was no fraud undermining your election loss, and Donald Trump said, I don't care. Just say there was and leave the rest to me and my Republican allies in Congress. How about President Zelensky? He said, look, I want you to announce an investigation into Joe Biden and his son. It doesn't matter that there is no investigation. You don't need to conduct an investigation. You just need to announce an investigation. And you know what? Shame on us and shame on our law enforcement authorities and our intelligence community not to have tackled this, not to have wrestled it to the ground and put a stop to Donald Trump's nonsense earlier on. If they had, we wouldn't be where we are today.
Yeah. And I think, a big reason, and I know that we're going off on a tangent here, but I think a big reason why it's so important to do this and to reach people is because the right-wing media ecosystem works as such a hermetically sealed ecosystem. And then when they get information in there, nobody ever gets actual information because they're not able to have any insight into that stuff. It's so important to just try to inject honest, truthful information into the news, whether it's here on YouTube, whether it's, on Facebook, whether it's in mainstream media, because so much of what the right relies on right now is just introducing this bullshit narrative, regardless of whether it's true or not, because they know full well that people aren't going to pay attention to the fact checks. They're not going to follow up for more accurate information. And they have people like now gone Tucker Carlson, who would just say, well, I'm not telling you that something is true or not. I'm just asking questions here. And this is basically a strategy that's been employed by the right for so long, where they give themselves just enough plausible deniability that they can, protect themselves from any legal liability, and yet at the same time get the point across that they're trying to get across, which is, to feed their audience this disinformation.
And Brian, that's why we need juries to decide these issues, because we're going to give this case to the E. Jean Carroll jury, and they're going to get their decision right. Once Donald Trump gets indicted and prosecutors are standing in the well of the court, arguing to 12 people in a jury box, sitting as the conscience of the community, all the propaganda, all the disinformation, all the Fox News nonsense melts away. And those 12 jurors who swear, they take an oath to decide the case based only on the evidence they see in the courtroom, they're going to get it right time and time again, just like they're getting it right in the Oath Keepers cases, where they have convicted in all 3 conspiracy cases brought against Oath Keepers. They're about to convict, I predict, in the Proud Boys case. Juries tend to get things right, and that's why we need to get all of these matters in front of a jury.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it's pretty amazing to see what happens when you're not contending with the whole both sidesism of a right-wing media ecosystem with such an insanely outsized role here. But anyway, I want to move over to the possible results of this case. Now, E.G. and Carroll's side is seeking damages and a retraction of Trump's defamatory statements. Do you actually see Trump doing that if he loses here? And how could that work? If that is one of the sticking points in this case, if he is found liable and he refuses to do it, how does something like that work?
Yeah, I'm going to bet my $1 that Donald Trump will be retracting exactly nothing. And this is about money damages, and I don't know that a defendant can be compelled to apologize or retract as a consequence of losing a sexual assault and defamation civil lawsuit. So it may very well be that's something that E. Jean Carroll's team, her lawyers, demand as part of a settlement. I don't know that will actually formally be ordered, but what can go on, Brian, is there can be post-verdict negotiations. I've been involved in that myself, where I really wanted to develop a defendant as the cooperating witness, but he refused to plead guilty and cooperate. So what did I do? I took him to trial, got him convicted, put a whole bunch of years hanging over his head, and then I stepped back to him. I said, what about now, sport? You want to negotiate now where you're looking at 30 years in prison? And sometimes I could bring people on board because I would negotiate with them post-verdict. So it wouldn't shock me if this jury finds for E. Jean Carroll, and then maybe there's a little bit of horse trading, some negotiation between E. Jean Carroll's legal team and Donald Trump's legal team about what the ultimate sort of penalty should look like.
Got it. And just one last question here. It's kind of a housekeeping question. We are now in week 2 of this defamation trial. What's the timeline here looking like?
Judge Kaplan announced up front 1 to 2 weeks. This week is week 2. Wouldn't shock me if it lingered into a third week. And then the other thing, you can never predict how long a jury will deliberate. I've had juries deliberate 30 minutes. I've had juries deliberate for weeks. Now that's impacted by the length of the trial ordinarily, but I would suspect we will be hearing a jury verdict probably sometime into next week.
Got it. Okay. Well, for anybody watching, to stay on top of this case as it, very quickly heads to a close here, make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.